Labor has scraped home for a win in the Eden-Monaro by-election, the first electoral test for Anthony Albanese and Scott Morrison since the election and since the arrival of the pandemic. I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. It's 100 years since a government won a by-election from an opposition, a record that's still standing this morning. The Liberals have done better than governments usually do at by-elections, but Scott Morrison's popularity during this pandemic hasn't translated into victory in Eden-Monaro. The win is a relief for Anthony Albanese, but Labor's primary vote is down by just over 2% on the latest count. The party has relied on preferences to get there. It was a drawn-out count, which was still too close to call when the two contenders addressed their supporters.
We don't have a result, and it would be really nice to say that we did tonight, but we don't. It's been 100 years since the government has won a seat off the opposition in a by-election. The average swing against the government has been 3.8% in those by-elections. So far, we're going the other way.
And I need to be clear about this. When the cameras go away and the spotlight fades, my resolve will not. Regardless of the outcome of this election, I will continue to stand up for these regions that I know and love. I'll continue to stand up for people affected by bushfires. I'll continue to stand up for farmers. I'll continue to stand up for mothers who need maternity services. I'll continue to stand up for better roads, better access to healthcare and education. I'll continue to stand up for workers, and I'll continue to stand up for regions, regardless of what happens.
Well, let's bring in the ABC's election analyst, Anthony Green, for the very latest. Anthony, we wrapped up the broadcast last night. Before midnight, it was still too close to call then. Where are things at this morning?
Well, we got the preference counts from those Queanbeyan pre-polls. We've got two more pre-polls. And once we factored those in, these are the first preference votes. The Liberal Party's leading 37.8, Labor 36.2. Then we've got the Nationals and the Greens. That's change of vote there. The Labor vote's down about 2%. The Nationals vote down, Liberal vote up. 5.5% there for the shooters, fishers and farmers who ran, and the Green vote down. The two-party preferred, basically no swing, 0.1 to Labor, maybe none by the end of the count. But that's basically the same result as the last election. And
within the seat, Anthony, where were some of the more interesting swings?
Well, the funny thing is that when you get a 0% swing, what you end up with is the booths just scattered either side of zero. So there was a swing to Labor down around Beagle, where Christy McBain comes from. Fiona Copvoice is from the northern end of the south coast and got a swing to her there. And across the rest of the electorate, the swings were scattered, some towards Liberals, some towards Labor. And I mean, some of that's just caused by changes of where people vote since the last election. So overall, not very much happened in the overall swing. Labor first preference to vote down, but I think in the end I suspect Mike Kelly's departure as a sitting member was the most important factor, because while there's talk of an average swing, those average swings are usually much smaller in opposition-held seats when there's a by-election, when the opposition has lost a sitting member.
All right, Anthony Green, thanks very much for the update there. Well, the only other big news this morning is, of course, the coronavirus lockdowns here in Melbourne. We'll get to that with Casey Briggs a little later. We're going to stick, though, with Eden-Monaro for now. Anthony Albanese needed a win, and he got one, although yet another drop in Labor's primary vote will concern some in his ranks. Voters aren't, however, flocking to the coalition. The next election is not in the bag for the government, despite the current popularity for Scott Morrison during the pandemic. The numbers in Parliament, of course, stay the same, but Christy McBain will be a new face in Canberra and one to watch. Let's see what our panel makes of it. We're joined this week by Andrew Probyn, Nikki Sava and Peter Harcher. And we had hoped that you'd all be back here in the studio by now, but anyway, here I am on my lonesome. We'll get to the reasons for that around the coronavirus shortly. Let's start, though, with what's happened in this by-election. Well, Peter, to you first on this. If it is a status quo result, what do you think that means for both sides?
Well, each will try to find an argument for declaring victory here, David. As you know, the government's argument will be that there's been, rather than the typical swing against the government of nearly 4%, there's been essentially no swing, and therefore it's a victory. The Labor Party will say that even though there's been a slight swing against them, they've lost a couple of percentage points on the primary vote. The Labor Party will say that, well, that's cool because we've won the seat. Not only that, but we've won the seat where the Prime Minister is enjoying a popularity rating, which is, according to a news poll, the second highest in the history of that poll in a quarter century, and second only to Kevin Rudd when he was at his peak. So they'll say, Labor will say, this proves that we are a viable and successful political party, even in the face of the country's most remarkably popular Prime Minister. But taking a step back from the two parties' claims, David, just to repeat what Anthony Green just said, this is a vote where not much happened. So perhaps if you're looking at this not as a partisan player but as a fair-minded observer, you could say that the Australian electorate is suspending judgment, that this is an extraordinary time, there is a pandemic, the country is cheering on the Prime Minister to do well, but it's a time of great uncertainty where we know there's a tremendous economic disruption. We know that there are outbreaks, further outbreaks of the virus going on in Victoria, and there will be others elsewhere. And that the electorate is simply saying, we're not going to make a resounding choice either way. We're going to see what happens and judge the performance of the two political parties when we get to Judgment Day, which is still up to 2 years away.
Yeah, Nikki, do you think it's unequivocal whether this result is better for one side or the other?
Well, if Albanese is to have any chance at all of leading Labor to the next election, then he has to win this seat. And even if he wins it by one vote, it is still a win. It's a win for him and it's not a win for Morrison. Now, Morrison, towards the end of the campaign, gave a very important speech, and he laid it out saying that this was like the 1930s. It reminded him of the 1930s. Now, if that's the case, then there should have been a flight to certainty by people. There wasn't. There was a slow walk, maybe, to certainty. And I think in this climate, people are already anxious enough. They don't want their anxieties exacerbated. They don't want conflict. What they want to hear from their leaders is solutions and answers to how we're going to get out of this mess. And I don't think that they heard enough of that from either side. They certainly didn't hear enough of it from the government. And I don't think Albanese gave enough of an insight either, beyond not leaving people behind. Well, he needs to do more than that. I think what it showed was people want to hear more from their leaders about how we're going to get out of this mess. And until they hear that, they're more or less in a holding pattern. OK, they've given Morrison a tick for the way that he has handled the COVID so far, but they're withholding judgment. They want to see how he's going, what he's going to do to get us out of this mess. And
Andrew, what do you think this result means?
Well, we're examining the entrails here, but this was hardly clinical conditions. There have been a lot of contaminants when it comes to whatever question you're putting towards it. From the Liberal side, has Scott Morrison recovered from his horror bushfires? Well, you'd have to say he largely has, although, you know, it's not exactly bonny health down there. For the Labor Party, we were told that Mike Kelly was worth 1 to 3%. Well, it turns out that the primary has dropped by 3%. But I think that Labor will be disappointed that they couldn't claim victory last night, given that this is, as Nikki was saying, something that they have, a seat that they have to hold. Another alarming element of this for the Labor Party will be the fact that it was so heavily reliant on some of the preference flows. A Labor source says to me that the leakage from the Nats was something like 20 to 30% to the Labor Party, especially in Queanbeyan, which is where John Barilaro was perhaps keener than most to see a Labor victory. And now we also saw the Shooters Party breaking about 60% to the ALP, I'm told. All up, you've got a preference swing to Labor of 8%. Now, you can't imagine that that would happen at the general election. So, you know, it's not great for Labor, albeit it looks like they're going to win and they'll be mightily relieved. But it's not tremendous either for Scott Morrison, because you have been seeing that competition between the pre-pandemic Scott Morrison and the post-pandemic Scott Morrison, which is who has performed much stronger.
You mentioned John Barilaro there in this question about whether the Nationals were indeed seriously urging their supporters to preference the Liberals or indeed Labor. He did admit last night on Sky that at last year's election, well, here's what he did with his vote.
And I tell you tonight, I did vote for Mike Kelly last time after my Nats in Sophie Wade. But, you know, why? Because I vote for the man and not necessarily the party, and that's what you'll find today. People vote Nationals and not necessarily a party.
Yeah, and if it turns out at this by-election that the preference flow from Nationals voters has gone 20 or 30% to Labor, Andrew, there'll be a few recriminations within the coalition.
Well, as there should be. Now, the other point about this is if Labor, as Anthony Green and others expect, do pick up this seat, then that does allow John Barilaro to run at the general election. And I think the general election is going to be next year. So John Barilaro, who was looking at potentially running in this by-election for the Nats, he now has opportunity to switch from state parliament to federal.
Look, what does this change? Sorry, Nikki.
Can I just sort of buy in a little bit there? I've had quite a few Liberals talking to me about Barilaro and what he's done. They use words like treachery and sabotage, and this is all going to erupt at some point, because if the government ends up not winning the seat, then a lot of the blame will be shooted home to Barilaro, which would make for a very interesting contest last time. If Barilaro had the guts to put his hand up this time, which he didn't have the guts to do, if he had the guts to put it up next time, which he didn't have the guts to do this time, quite simply, I don't think that he would have any chance of winning the seat, but he was determined to poison the wells for other people, and I don't think people will forgive him for that.
Peter, the government is grappling right now, of course, with economic recovery, what to do with JobKeeper and JobSeeker, which are due to end in September, how to get us back on the path to growth. They've also got questions around climate change to address and so on. Are there clear messages from this result when it comes to some of these big policy matters?
Well, it means that Morrison has withstood the bushfire anger, which a couple of months ago you would have thought was pretty hard to do. Otherwise, this is an electorate looking for confidence, looking for direction, looking for guidance from the government. And this is something that I'm sure will, as you touch on the economic decisions to come, David, the government does need to make in short order, and they are in the process of making decisions about JobSeeker, JobKeeper. I think this just tells us that the electorate, Eden-Monaro in particular, but the larger community, is in no condition to see a quick withdrawal of support, especially as we see last week we saw consumer confidence numbers, economic consumer confidence numbers fall. Well, that wasn't just in Eden-Monaro, that was nationally. So I think this is telling the government there is an opportunity for it to show leadership, to continue to generate economic confidence. And a critical part of the economic confidence, let me add, David, This thing is usually portrayed as a contest, a trade-off. You can have a health result or you can have economic growth. You can't have both. And the only way you can have economic growth is to remove the health protections. I would suggest to you what we see worldwide and what we see here is that these are not a trade-off, this is a continuum, that you only get economic confidence when you have health confidence. When you have an unsuccessful so-called reopening in Victoria, it attacks confidence. Consumers don't want to go out, they don't want to spend, investors don't want to invest. So you need to produce economic confidence, you need a clean and clear health result.
We'll come back to that issue around how to tackle the health problem and the associated economic problem. Up next, though, the Shadow Agriculture Minister, Joel Fitzgibbon. First, his Labor leader, Anthony Albanese, addressing the party faithful last night.
I said when Mike Kelly resigned that it would be tough for Labor to hold this seat, that we started off on 48% of the two-party preferred vote because we lost a member who had been an outstanding representative. But we made a commitment at that point in time that we would stand up during this campaign, as the Australian Labor Party always will, for the people who are left behind.
Joel Fitzgibbon, welcome to the program. Since Anthony Albanese spoke there last night, the numbers have improved for Labor. Are you now confident Labor has won Eden-Monaro?
Good morning, Spearsy. Well, we're not claiming the win yet, of course. We're very cautious about that, but things are looking very good for us and they'll continue to improve, I think, over the course of the balance of the counting. It's a bit of an ugly win for us, I can see, but it's a win just the same. It was a difficult election for us. The advantages of incumbency, for example, was an enormous hurdle to overcome. So full credit to Anthony Albanese, who injected himself energetically into this campaign and looks like walking away victorious.
When you say it was an ugly win, what do you mean by that?
Well, ugly but not so ugly, as, of course, as Scott Morrison's loss. He's been unable, as Peter pointed out, to translate his high approval ratings to his primary vote in Eden-Monaro, and that will have them pondering long and hard over the coming weeks. We, of course, lost a bit off our primary vote again, coming off a fairly low base in 2019, but as you pointed out, we lost Mike Kelly. We have a Prime Minister who, with the opposition's full support, has been literally spending hundreds of billions of dollars providing support to people. He's had, of course, saturation media now for weeks. I've never seen the advantages of incumbency so large. Of course, as I said, his approval ratings are high, but he wasn't able to improve his primary vote by much last night.
Just on the Labor primary vote, this has been a concern for you after, well, 3 federal election defeats. We saw big primary vote drops in Queensland, and in your own seat at last year's election, it's gone down a bit more here in Eden-Monaro, and you can't clearly always rely on preferences from shooters and fishers and maybe even some National Party voters as well. How concerned are you about that?
Well, we do need to lift our primary vote, David, and Anthony Albanese understands that, but we were never likely to do that yesterday. And can I just issue some praise for Christy McBain? I mean, I've been around a long time, David, as you know. She was a first-time candidate, and I've not campaigned alongside a better candidate than Christy McBain. So we'll have her again next time, and she'll have an opportunity now to consolidate herself in that electorate. And I've no doubt she'll lift that primary vote next time around.
What about Anthony Albanese? Is he now guaranteed to lead Labor into the next election?
Absolutely, and that was never in doubt. This was always going to be a closely run thing, and have a think about it. He inherited a broken Labor Party after the 2019 election. Trust in the Labor Party, in the broader electorate, had collapsed. And he very quickly, having been elected unopposed, set upon a rebuilding process and quickly began to take the Labor Party back to the sensible centre ground. Now, think about it, he had about 6 months to do that. Then the bushfires came along, and then, of course, COVID-19 followed. So, you know, it takes a whole political cycle at least to rebuild that trust and to reshape the party's policies. He's had about 6 months to do so.
And yet, normally at by-elections, oppositions gain ground. Under Bill Shorten, Labor's vote went up, I think, at every contestable by-election. It's gone down here. What do you put that down to?
It means that we still have a lot of work to do. I mean, have a look at what Anthony Albanese has done. He was quick to jettison unpopular policies like franking credits. He was quick to start establishing his bona fides with our traditional blue-collar base, talking about the importance of the coal mining industry and the resources sector more generally to the Australian economy, using his headland speeches to talk lots about jobs and job security, recalibrating our climate change policy so that we're left with a policy which is meaningful, but a policy capable of taking the majority of the Australian people with us on that journey, and therefore capable of winning us an election. So,
and are you comfortable with where that climate policy is now at for Labor?
Yeah, I am absolutely, and we've seen more examples this week of firms exiting the Australian market because, in part, high energy policies. So this is, I think, this is fertile ground for us now. We need to both save and create more jobs in the manufacturing sector, for example, and getting some energy policy back in place and some certainty back in place is very important.
Is it still your view, Joel Fitzgibbon, that Labor should embrace the government's 2030 emissions target of 26 to 28%?
I think talk about targets has been absolutely overdone, David. We're not all that far, of course, now off 2030.
Okay. With respect, you're the one who suggested supporting the government's target. I'm just wondering if that's still your view?
We've set a zero net emissions target.
For 2050.
And that has to be our focus now. This will not be a linear path to 2050. Technology will, of course, come into play along that road. So no one really knows what 2030 looks like under Scott Morrison. We've had emissions flatlining now for 7 years, and it's pretty difficult to know where you need to be in 2030 when we are in opposition.
Okay,
and
but just to be clear on this, what do you think Labor's position should be then on 2030? Just no position?
I think 2030 has become irrelevant. When we set last time a 2030 target, it was 2015. It's now 2020, and by the time the next election comes around, it's going to be 2021, 2022. So as a benchmark, 2030, I think is...
What about 2035? Will you need a target for some sort of short-term goal?
Well, again, I don't think the trajectory will be linear. So we'll continue to have conversations as we develop our policies. As I said, we were very early into that process when COVID-19 came along. But you can be sure that Labor will take a meaningful climate change policy into the next election. It's going to be difficult because, again, Scott Morrison has allowed those emissions to flatline now for 7 years. But we'll take a meaningful policy, but we'll take a policy which can be embraced by the majority of the Australian people.
And do you think, when it comes to economic recovery, the future of support payments and so on, Labor needs to be a bit clearer about what it wants to happen?
No, Labor needs to continue in opposition to hold the government to account. Right. What is very, very clear is that the government has mismanaged the support package. Some things, of course, have been done well and we've supported those, but it's become clear now that too many people have missed out, that the dole queues are longer than they needed to be as a result of those mistakes. And now people, including the business sector, is living with the uncertainty of what happens after September. Some decisions which, of course, were kicked down the road beyond the Eden-Monaro by-election.
Let me turn to defence. The government announced its defence strategic update during the week. You oversaw the 2009 Defence White Paper as Defence Minister back then. It called for 12 new submarines, long-range missiles and so on. Do you see similarities in this current document?
And you might recall, David, that when Kevin Rudd and I delivered that White Paper, people said we'd overreached on submarines. I don't think anyone would be arguing that now. Interestingly, the challenges that guided the 2009 White Paper are pretty much the challenges we face now. The difference is that those changes in our geopolitical situation have accelerated. So what the government's doing now is, I believe, exactly what a Labor government would be doing. But the real test is in the execution, and the submarine program is a perfect example of that, which is blown out in cost and is very, very late now. So talk is fine, but execution is necessary, and it's hard to have confidence in this government delivering on that execution.
What about when it comes to upsetting China? Not so long ago, you were critical of the government's decision to call for an inquiry into the origins of the pandemic. You said, quote, "We didn't need to be out there in front offending the Chinese." Is that still your view?
Yeah, it is still my view. We have to take no step backwards on our national interest and be most robust in defence of them. But there's a thing called diplomacy, and we don't unnecessarily have to be criticising the government of China when there's no need to be doing so. And, the idea of sending UN weapon-style inspectors into Wuhan without the consent of the Chinese government is just a silly thing to say, an unnecessary thing to say, and it just challenges our trading relationship with our biggest trading partner.
But are you saying we should factor in the need not to offend China? And then where do you stand on something like offering safe haven visas to people fleeing Hong Kong? Is that something that would offend China?
We should never hesitate to say what we need to say in defence of our national interests. And if that offends the Chinese, well, so be it. What I'm saying is that you don't unnecessarily have to say things which have the consequence of upsetting our major trading partner.
OK, so on Hong Kong, should Australia offer safe haven visas?
Well, we are a wealthy, responsible country, and of course the Labor Party has a great history here with Tiananmen Square under Bob Hawke, and we should take every opportunity working with the global community to do what we can to give safe haven to those who might in any way be threatened or disadvantaged by what's happening in Hong Kong.
Even if this, because it really will, offend China?
Well, I said earlier, when things are necessary, if they have the consequence of challenging our relationship, well, so be it. I just make the point again, it's not necessary to do it unnecessarily.
Final one, Matthias Cormann, you would have seen the Finance Minister's announced he's going to quit politics at the end of the year. You're, of course, on the other side of politics. Would we be happy to see him go, or will he be a loss to Parliament?
Oh, I wish Matthias well. He's been one of their better performers in my view. Matthias has always been a guy you could trust when a deal is cut in the Senate, and I've always respected that. He's been a serious player for a long, long time, and again, I wish him the best.
All right, Joel Fitzgibbon, thanks for joining us this morning.
A pleasure, David.
Before we get back to the panel, the other big story, of course, is the coronavirus lockdowns here in Melbourne. 3,000 residents in 9 public housing towers have been told they cannot leave their buildings for 5 days. Hundreds of police, rather than private security contractors this time, are going to be enforcing this ruling. What's brought all this about? Well, let's check in with Casey Briggs and The Curve.
We've seen a major escalation in Victoria's coronavirus crisis and a major imposition on these thousands of people living in these housing estates. The big question is, will this strategy work to stop the virus? We are still seeing growth in cases in Melbourne outside these hotspot areas, places like Wyndham in the southwest and inner Melbourne. Yesterday's numbers means that we now have a curve in the state that's about as tall as the first peak in March. But community transmissions, those infections with an unknown source, they're far higher. New South Wales still has the most cases overall of any state or territory, but Victoria is on track to overtake it on a per capita basis. Victoria is only a few hundred cases away from moving to the top of this list. Sadly, we are now seeing that the number of COVID-19 patients in Victorian hospitals is growing again. There are 25 seriously ill patients at the moment in the state. Hopefully, we see fewer numbers of hospitalised patients than the first time that we had case numbers as big as this. Why? Well, have a look at the age breakdown of all of Australia's coronavirus infections as of the end of March. More than half of them were over 45, almost a third of them over 60. But now have a look at the infections from the month of June. Less than 1 in 10 are over 60. Younger people are tending to be infected more at the moment, at least for now. One of the big questions through this entire current outbreak has been why Victoria and why now? Well, we now know that one of the reasons, at least part of the reason, is major failures in the state's hotel quarantine system. There are likely lots of lessons to be learned from that, lessons, David, that some states might like to know about now, but we're largely still in the dark about those failures. It appears the Victorian government's unwilling to talk about them while a judicial review is underway.
Casey Briggs, thank you very much. I want to get into some of those questions that Casey poses as to why things have gone wrong in Victoria. But just quickly to pick up on the interview with Joel Fitzgibbon there, Nikki, he described it as an ugly win in Eden-Monaro for Labor, but beyond that, it was pretty supportive of Anthony Albanese, guaranteeing indeed that he will be there at the next election as leader. What did you make of that?
Yes, I thought that was quite interesting. I would have been interested to see what Joel might have said if it had gone the other way. I think that would have been a lot trickier, shall we say. But obviously, you know, a win is a win is a win. And while I think there are still going to be some very rocky periods ahead for Albanese, his position, if he wins, will be stabilised. It will be a lot harder for his enemies, and let's face it, there are a few, to get stuck into him unless he makes mistakes and unless he fails to come up with, you know, a credible agenda of where to go from here. I think the problem is for Labor at the moment that they cannot rely on winning an election on the basis of the people who have been left behind. Firstly, there might not be enough of them. And secondly, that implies that these people might spend a life on welfare. Well, people need to be lifted out of that, right? There's got to be programs and projects and solutions that get people into work and to have some hope for the future beyond being on government handouts.
All right, well, let's turn to the coronavirus situation. The Victorian government, of course, the Premier yesterday announced that they're locking down entirely some 9 public housing towers, 3,000 residents. Here he was.
There will be no one going in other than residents who are returning home, and no one will be allowed out of those public housing towers. There will be a massive logistical task to make sure that those people are fed, given the support that they need. I think we're equal to that task, and I don't for a moment underestimate how challenging, how traumatic in some respects that will be for those 3,000 residents.
Now, we're talking here, of course, about vulnerable communities already, a lot of migrant communities as well. I'm told there's been a lot of confusion in some of these towers in particular about what this means and, you know, what happens if someone in the family is positive for coronavirus. Andrew, it is a controversial step. Does it make sense to you?
Well, look, it's alarming. Let's just turn our minds back to January when we saw the Chinese authorities welding up apartments, and we all looked on that with horror and we're just amazed that such activity could take place. Well, it's being done effectively in Victoria, a democracy, albeit without the welding, but with 500 police stopping people shifting. As you say, these are disadvantaged, vulnerable people. I understand that there were very few language translators on the ground, but lots of cops. Now, so my instant view would be one of concern for those inside who might feel threatened by the presence of police or worried about the future. It would be a very, very awful time. As to whether it is necessary, well, we know that 23 of the 108, I think, from the new infections yesterday announced come from within these housing Commission areas. So these are dire circumstances and drastic action. I hope they're necessary, put it that way. I can't really tell, but it is quite extraordinary to see this on Australian soil.
Peter, when it comes to the Andrews government handling of this whole crisis, very tough in the early stages in terms of the restrictions, shutting down schools and all of that. It seemed to have gyrated though, because with the hotel quarantine, clearly there were big failures. Now a very tough measure here with these public housing towers. What do you make of how Dan Andrews is handling this?
Well, 2 points, David. First, this is clearly incompetence. It's just deeply unimpressive that the state government could allow the situation to go from the virus close to elimination to now being raging again and having to have state borders reinforced against Victorians. We saw Daniel Andrews quick to sack 3 of his ministers over branch stacking. How many ministers have been removed for the bungling of the coronavirus?
I don't think anyone's taken responsibility at a ministerial level for what's going on.
Exactly. Not only has there been a failure of accountability and responsibility, but the underlying flaws, the bungling of this hotel quarantine, what on earth was going on? I mean, the stories emerging just suggest a completely ramshackle approach with a lack of any rigour. We're not even going to get the answers to those details because they fob everything off onto some long-winded inquiry. This is not the time for inquiries. It's the time for quick analysis and quick action and quick accountability. So I would mark the Andrews government down pretty sharply on this performance. The second thing, and just briefly I'd throw in, David, is that one of the reasons I think we saw this in Victoria is a warning to the rest of the country. And that is, I think we saw an excessive jubilation, a mission accomplished moment. This thing's been solved, great, let's just return to normal. Well, we cannot return to normal. Until there is a vaccine, there is only physical separation of humans from each other to prevent the virus from transmitting. We fall back on the 500-year-old Italian concept of quarantine, the quarantina, based on 40 days and 40 nights, which is in turn a biblical concept, about 40 days required for purification. That's all we've got. So I think this concept of back to normal, it's all over, party time, is going to lead to other states making the same mistake if they replicate that behaviour.
And Nikki, it complicates the economic recovery a little here too, doesn't it? I think Peter referred to earlier, the consumer confidence figures were down in the last week. They'd been going up, but they dropped again, and presumably that's because of what's happened in Victoria. How does this impact on those decisions for the government, the federal government, around JobKeeper and JobSeeker and so on?
Well, it definitely has an adverse impact. I mean, what has happened in Victoria is bad all round. It's bad psychologically, it's bad economically, and it's bad politically. Andrews has sustained considerable damage. The confidence of people has been undermined. The recovery will be set back, there's no doubt about that. The other thing is that obviously Andrews was one of the key movers inside National Cabinet. And he and Morrison, despite a couple of differences here and there, had built up a very close relationship. And I don't think Morrison would want to see Andrews weakened or powerless in what has to come next. So I think he would want to see Andrews pick up and get this thing under control as soon as possible.
I'm sure that's right.
Because
and David,
the longer
on
it
that
goes
point,
on...
On that point, Nikki, because that's a really important point that you've picked up there, the criticism of Dan Andrews in a political sense has been rather muted. There is this feeling that, go for, but for the grace of God, go I. The Premier's knowing that what's happening in Victoria could happen to them if shambolic process that Peter's talked about is seen elsewhere.
Clearly Scott Morrison has not.
And
been
there's
amongst
always
those.
the potential for that to happen.
Yeah, clearly
always the potential for that to happen.
The PM has not weighed in criticising Dan Andrews himself, and that goes to the point you're making there about the need to keep working together. We are seeing a bit of strain, though, elsewhere. The Queensland Premier, Anastasia Palaszczuk, said this.
I support the National Cabinet, but what I don't support is people being friendly inside those walls and then sending out others to do their dirty work. These border wars have got to stop, and I think a national leader should have been able to bring all of the states and territories together. Frankly, I'm a bit sick that Queensland has been singled out as opposed to South Australia and Tasmania, just to name a few.
Yeah, Andrew having a bit of a go there at Scott Morrison.
Peter Dutton.
and Peter Dutton, yeah.
Well, but also there's an election coming on, right? So Morrison himself has been a little bit tougher on Anastasia than he's been on some of the others. So everybody's positioning for what's to come. So they're both playing political games there, I think.
Can't get away from it. Look, we know in battling this virus, contact tracing is vital. It may not be necessarily all that easy to say, however.
Scaled up testing at a local level, combined with contact tracing.
There, but for the grace of God. Look, I want to turn to the defence.
Yeah, whatever it means.
That's it. The strategic update. So this was unveiled on Wednesday. A sharper focus on potential conflict in our region, plans to buy long-range missiles, a missile defence shield, all sorts of high-tech weapons being investigated and developed as well. Here was the Prime Minister.
We have not seen the conflation of global economic and strategic uncertainty now being experienced here in Australia, in our region, since the existential threat we faced when the global and regional order collapsed in the 1930s and 1940s. That is a sobering thought, and it's something I have reflected on quite a lot lately.
Peter, I thought the language from the Prime Minister was just as telling as the document itself. Clearly a great concern about what's happening with China.
Absolutely. I mean, this is...
Yes, and I asked him...
Sorry, Peter.
Sorry. Yeah, I asked Morrison on Friday why he had made that point in a public speech. Why would you compare today to the moment... the gravest moment in the history of modern civilization, where human liberty was almost extinguished on the planet, with both the Depression followed by the rise of fascism, and only the deadliest conflict in human history prevented the complete extinction of human liberty on the planet. Why would you say that in public? And he said because he didn't think the Australian public was sufficiently alert to the problem and that he wanted to emphasise the point. In other words, he thinks we need to wake up. And I suspect that we will probably hear a little bit more from him in future on this theme, that this is a very grave crisis. So the defence, you're right, his rhetoric was telling. And I thought the other thing he said to me was pretty interesting too, which was that, he said he's learned from former Prime Ministers that they rarely repeat the same mistake twice. And from that, I took that he'd completely bungled the bushfire response by missing in action and going on holidays while the country burned. He didn't miss the pandemic crisis. He led decisively and he's been rewarded with high approval ratings. And he's not going to duck the strategic crisis that we now face with a Chinese government increasingly belligerent, aggressive, and it's coming hard at Australia, as well as a number of other countries. It's coming hard at Australia as well.
Yeah, Andrew, in the document itself, though, what's the importance, what's the significance of what's been committed, what's been laid out?
Well, the importance of the document is that we effectively go from a largely defensive defence strategy to one that has offensive capability, and in fact it's a declared offensive ability. So it is a big shift. It is a shift that also effectively says to Australia's military, let's get back to our knitting, let's look after our region, and let's not go on missions elsewhere in the world unless it's absolutely necessary. Now, this again is shaped by the perceived China threat, that we have an adversarial situation between China and the United States that casts this shadow. The reference to the 1930s and 1940s clearly is also looking and reflecting on the fact that Australia was underprepared for World War II. But some of what the echoes of Wednesday's announcement actually started in, say, 1999 in East Timor, where Australia wanted to go in and protect the East Timorese, thought that the Americans would come in and help. The Clinton administration provided logistics, diplomatic support, but Australia had to go in and do it on its own. It was an Australian-led mission. That is the sort of attitude that this document brings to Australia's defence settings. But it's remarkable too, looking at the weaponry that we're going to be buying. It's not going to stop a potential invasion, you would think, but it certainly is a deterrent, and that's what this is about. It's being more forceful and being willing to respond.
Yeah, and as you say, being able to operate in an environment with a less predictable ally in the United States. But clearly the big concern is China. While the language is always careful around these things, the Defence Minister, Linda Reynolds, did, well, offer this suggestion.
Australia has watched closely as China has actively sought to gain greater influence in the Indo-Pacific. Where such actions have unsettled the stability of our region, we have joined with others in clearly expressing our concerns.
Yeah, and Nikki, then we've got the suggestion that Australia, and clearly the Prime Minister is giving very strong indications we will, offer a safe haven visa or some sort of pathway to protect those who want to flee Hong Kong with the new national security law that's just been imposed by China, a draconian law with a pretty sweeping application for anyone who is considered by the authorities to have acted against China's interests here. This, I would suggest, more than plans to buy more missiles in a few years' time, is going to get right up the nose of Beijing. We already see their angry response. How sensitive will this one be, do you think, for the Morrison government? What does it tell us that he's willing to do this?
Well, I think everything we do at the moment gets up China's nose, but I don't think there will be any quibbles at all from the Australian end about what he's proposed on providing safe haven for Hong Kongers. I think it's the right thing to do, it's the essential thing to do, and it should be followed through. So I think that is eminently defensible. And I don't think there has been any quibble, really, from the Australian end about what the Prime Minister has actually done, what he's announced. There might be some quibble with his use of language, with the way that he maybe has tried to ramp up things. I do think that community sentiment on this is quite strong and has been for some time. And I think it's only now that the government and the Prime Minister is really tapping into that. So community sentiment has actually been ahead of the government on China, on China's bullying and its belligerence. And I think they'd be quite pleased that finally someone is standing up. But I think the language, there needs to be some care taken with the language.
Look, when it comes to Hong Kong, Peter, I mean, we're just sort of learning about what this new law will mean. It can apply to people outside Hong Kong. It could apply to non-citizens. If you write a strongly worded piece condemning the Chinese Communist Party, next time you go to Hong Kong, arguably under this law, you could be in trouble. So, this is why Australia and others, the UK and Canada, are looking at what to do here. But is this the right measure to draw a line in the sand on, to make it clear to China that this is something we want to push back on?
Yes, look, you're right, David. It's the concept of an extraterritorial law where what the Australian Chinese community may say in Melbourne or what any other citizen anywhere in the world might say about the status of Hong Kong could be subject to law in China is just an outrageous ambit claim and just a stunning departure from any pretense at international norms and laws. It's just outrageous. Is this the right point at which to draw a red line, you ask, David? Look, Australia's spent about 30, 40 years. We've allowed the Chinese government to train us into what I've described as a preemptive kowtow. That is, every time the Australian government considers something, they try to second guess or anticipate any potential Chinese interest. Oh, should we do this or will we make the Chinese angry? And we stayed in the preemptive kowtow, worrying about Chinese responses until just a couple of years ago when a couple of things happened. And this, I think, was the red line. It was the Turnbull government, with Morrison as Treasurer, that decided first to ban Huawei from the Australian 5G system. Second, to introduce the foreign interference and espionage laws, which are now only just starting to be enforced. They were red lines. The Chinese government responded first with a political sanction, no high-level contact between the two countries. Then there's the economic sanction when the Morrison government asked for an inquiry into the COVID debacle. We've seen $25 billion worth of Australian exports either already sanctioned or threatened by the Chinese government. And we see a continuing rhetorical and political, as well as a cyber war going on against Australia. So the line's been drawn. The Chinese response is clear. We are seeing a concerted, multi-pronged Chinese Communist Party pressure campaign against Australia. Look, will it make any difference if the Australian government extends asylum to Hong Kong asylum seekers? I don't think so. It will just give the Chinese government another opportunity to ramp up its pressure campaign that they're doing anyway and will continue to do until they break Australia's will. That's what this is about. Look, so we either agree that we're going to have our will broken or we continue to do the right thing. Is it the right thing to allow them asylum? Well, not only is it a great recruiting opportunity for Australia to recruit some high-quality talent, it's also the right thing to do to be a beacon of liberty.
Tick, tick, win-win. Look, I'm just going to jump in there because we're running out of time, but I want to just get a thought from you, Andrew Probyn, on Matthias Cormann. Mentioned earlier that he's confirmed that he's going to go at the end of the year. Just give us a snapshot of what's gone on there and how much of a loss this will be to the government.
Well, this is a very big loss. This is one of the big moments in the life of the coalition, even with the removal of prime ministers, and he's been involved in some of those. Look, Matthias Cormann has been one of those constant figures. He's one of, in fact, the only coalition minister who's remained in his portfolio since they came to power. But what's important about Matthias Cormann is the fact that he's been the great negotiator. He really is the fixer. It wasn't Christopher Pyne, it was Matthias Cormann. He was the fixer, and losing Matthias Cormann, a big figure, someone who always dealt with people courteously and with respect, is going to be a big deal. But as important as he has been, his star diminished when he turned on Turnbull. This was the fatal moment, and I'm sure Nikki Savva will want to jump in here.
Well, we're going to do that in final observations if I can push it off there because the clock's ticking. We will be back with those final observations shortly. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer-at-large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with photographer for the Nine group of newspapers, The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, Alex Ellinghausen. Welcome, mate.
Thanks again for having me on, Mike.
Alex, there's nothing like a by-election in the seat of Eden-Monaro to show for whom the bellwether tolls.
And to Anthony Albanese's great relief, Christy McBean has done it.
It's also the first female member of the seat of Eden-Monaro, which was an original 1901 Federation seat. It's always been held by men up to this point. quite a long campaign, really, and it was a pretty quiet start, wasn't it?
Yeah, look, I think that was the height of the social distancing restrictions, so there weren't a lot of people out on the streets. All you could hear were crickets.
The Liberal Party did select Fiona Convoy's.
I think the intention was to visit a boutique chocolate shop near Murrumbeatman, and unfortunately the first doorstop interview was in front of a snake habitat, and these things happen.
Yeah, all candidates seem to spend a lot of time in local businesses.
When the coronavirus restrictions started coming through, you kind of felt like the bushfire recovery stories were forgotten a little bit.
Yeah.
It was inconceivable in January to think that any other story could eclipse the bushfires that we've had this summer.
There was a lot of elbow bumping from all sides, wasn't there?
It's one of those things that we've probably seen a little bit too much of this campaign.
I think this chap at Gugon expressed the feeling of all punters in the good electorate of Eden-Monaro when he sort of said, "Get off my lawn."
It's such an Australian thing. It doesn't matter who you are.
Yep.
You can be the Prime Minister and you can still get told to get off someone's lawn.
Yeah, get off my lawn, PM. In the last week of the campaign, the Prime Minister flew choppers into Lobs Hole, which is where one of the tunnels is going to go in Snowy 2.0, basically to stand beside a candidate, Fiona Convoy's, and do thumbs up by a very big hole in the ground.
There's such big productions, these visits by the Prime Ministers, that you, at almost any point, you're waiting for Rob Sitch and the Working Dog production crew to come out and say, cut.
He inspected a miniature model of the drilling machine that's about to be installed.
Is that what it is?
It is a drilling machine.
It almost looks a little bit like a lightsaber, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Reid Parker suggested that it could be the democracy sausage, and he's apologising to you here.
And what else we got? The Chico roll.
The Chico roll. That most Australian of items, the Chico roll was placed in here. Sorry, not sorry, says Mitch Lees. Mitch, can I tell you, Alex loves it when people meme his pictures, so just feel free.
It almost looks like this break glass in case of emergency Chico roll.
Yeah, it really does, doesn't it?
In this context, it almost looks like it's the Prime Minister's hangry face.
This week, the Prime Minister was on the defensive. Overseas, you see big parades of missiles going up the grand parades of the world. What did the Prime Minister bring to this announcement?
Oh, look, we had a couple of booklets. He held them up. That was a good visual.
A lovely David Pope, Make Eden-Monaro Great Again, preparing for a more dangerous and disorderly world as the missiles sort of taking off the big sign here.
I love all the detail in this imagery and even the authorisation.
Reheated and re-announced by Scotty from Marketing Canberra. Bit of Stanley Kubrick here as Scott Morrison sitting on the missile with good news. We finally got a roof over our heads as some of the bushfire victims. And there are still people living in tents down the coast. It must be remembered in the middle of winter.
Yeah.
Alex, it's been a great pleasure unpicking the events of this week, and I'll let you do the honours.
Thanks again for having me, Mike, and back to you, Spearsy.
Very good. Well, time for some final observations. Quick one from me first. The Australian Federal Police this week recommended prosecutors consider laying charges against the ABC's Dan Oakes. Dan and fellow journalist Sam Clark have been under investigation for an extraordinary 3 years over their Afghan file stories, exposing allegations about Australian soldiers committing war crimes. Sam, who is the executive producer of this program, will not face any charges. But the fact the Director of Public Prosecutions is now considering charging Dan for factual reporting clearly in the public interest, well, it's deeply troubling, a dark moment for press freedom in this country. Peter, your final observation.
Well, by-elections in Australia, state of democracy in trouble around the world, number of democracies in the world been declining for a dozen years now, brings me back to one of my favourite all-time quotes about democracy and its real purpose. Karl Popper, Austrian philosopher, said that the point of democracy is not that it guarantees the best possible government, but that it allows the bloodless removal of a bad one.
Nikki.
Just on Matthias Cormann, excuse me, no surprise that he's leaving. He told me in 2017 that if Turnbull, excuse me, if Turnbull lost the leadership, then he would leave. I think the way that it happened is a tragedy for Cormann and for the government. The surprise now, I guess, is who will fill all the slots. I think Simon Birmingham for Defence and Government Leader. The question is whether Morrison will have the guts to remove Linda Reynolds and put Peter Dutton in the Defence portfolio, which is another story that's going around at the moment.
Yes, well, plenty for us to talk about the months ahead on that front. Andrew.
Well, Eden-Monaro today, this weekend. Are we going to see another by-election by the end of the year? There's a lot of interest and curiosity about David Coleman. We haven't had a Minister for Immigration since December last year. We still don't know why he's taken this time off. So when we've got a very big reshuffle coming up at the end of the year, is there going to be one other complication?
All right, much to look forward to there. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Now, we did mention earlier the controversy over whether some Nationals were really preferencing the Liberals or secretly directing votes Labor's way in this by-election. The Nationals candidate didn't help things when he was asked. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Well, I'm out here with Labor as our first preference. So, Labor as our preference. We're fully behind Fiona.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.